Afternoon or good evening to everybody. Thanks and welcome for joining us today. A little bit of groundwork here up front. We'll go through some slides and then we'll get down to business. As you probably know, IMAGINiT is a subsidiary of RAND Worldwide. We are a leading provider of Autodesk solutions, professional services, as well as training. Alongside IMAGINiT is RAND 3D, a sister company that deals with Dassault and PTC software, as well as Ascent, who writes and produces the training manuals for Autodesk, Dassault, and PTC software. If you've ever taken a training class, either in person or online with us, then you've worked out of an Ascent training manual. So here's a little bit of a map showing where we are located throughout the North America, United States and Canada. This is a little bit of an older map. It doesn't show some of our newer offices that were part of ASI. Some of those aren't listed on here. But if you take a look at that map, you can see that chances are we probably have somebody close to you. So IMAGINiT offers professional services in areas such as consulting, process automation, software development. We also offer multiple options for training, whether that be self-paced e-learning through our Productivity Now platform or live online classes. Whatever training methods works best for your company and for your personnel, we've got you covered. IMAGINiT is an industry-leading partner with Autodesk. We are the leading provider of Autodesk software products and the largest Autodesk authorized training center partner in North America. We have proven implementation methodologies and flexible support systems, which adding all those things together, that equals top ratings and customer satisfaction. Alrighty, so I'm going to go ahead and end the slideshow, and I will switch over to Inventor. And Gladys, can you verify that you can see my Inventor screen now?
Yes, we can see your screen clearly.
Thank you very much. Alrighty. As I mentioned earlier, today we're going to discuss some of the out-of-the-box iLogic snippets that you may not be using. And when I say out-of-the-box, I mean the standard snippets that come or that are included with iLogic. We'll also look at doing some modifications to those to make them even more helpful. As you know, snippets need arguments. They need values passed to them that are specific to what you're trying to do. And we'll look at, again, taking those and making them work best to our advantage. So the first one I want to talk about is a few different ways that we can export parameters from an Inventor document. I say document because it really doesn't matter if we're going to talk about assemblies or parts, whatever I need to get that information out of. And a few reasons that I'd want to possibly export parameters are for documenting a given configuration. Right? I want to know what those inputs were when I built this configuration. Recreating the same parameters inside of another file, or helping to troubleshoot a configurator. Right? If you're building a configurator and someone is running and testing it, you want to know what inputs that they used. Right? So the first thing I'm going to do here is go ahead and create a new rule. So I'm right-clicking in my iLogic browser and choosing Add Rules. I'm going to give it a useful name, right? Exporting parameters. So again, this first one it's on the Custom tab of our Snippets panel. Okay, we're used to dealing with the System panel here, where all our parameters, our components, our constraints, all of those snippets are located. Don't forget about this handy Custom tab over here on the right. Okay, custom snippets allow me to write my own snippets, and it's a good way of saving those. It's a good repository for saving those custom snippets that I write. Really quickly, if I wanted to create my own I could simply have a bit of code in my rules editor, highlight that and right click. And down at the very bottom of my contextual menu, there is capture snippet. Okay? And this is a way of saving my snippet. I would give it some kind of useful name, some kind of category. In this case, if I leave it at just my snippets, it's simply going to show up under this main category that we see over here. If I want to create a new one, I simply type that information right here and it will create a new category. Okay. So we can add tooltips if we want. By default, it's going to use the code as part of my tooltip. The tooltip is what shows up when I hover over that icon. I'm gonna go ahead and create this just for the time being, just so we can see that over here, right? That's my new category, and then there's my new snippet, okay? So I did a webcast called Back to the Basics Part 3 a while back, and that goes into custom snippets more detailed, and that is available on our YouTube page if you want to go out and check that out. But what we're going to look at is the text file create snippet here in the My Snippets section. So I'm going to double click that guy so he ends up into my rules editor. And let's take a look at what it's doing here. The first line obviously is just a comment telling us what's happening. The second line is starting what's called a stream writer. That's a way of writing data to a file. Okay, we're taking the current document name with this doc.path and file name without the extension, right? That's what the false argument here is telling me. And then I'm concatenating txt on the back of it. So in essence, what I'm doing here is starting a new text file using the assembly file name. Okay. These next few lines are simply showing you examples how to use the write line method to add text to that text file. And then at the very end there, they're closing it. Okay, the close method. Then they're launching that. Again, they're using that same file name, and that's going to launch the text file that you just created using whatever default program your Windows is recognizing for the TXT extension. Okay. So as I mentioned before, I utilize code like this for exporting key inputs that are used to define a configuration. Usually this means, the parameters, selections that the user had made, entities that are on the form or that user interface. This serves a couple different purposes. It's a great debugging tool to use during testing. Contrary to what you think, the code you write initially may not always do what you want it to do, right? So whenever myself or a client is testing a build of something, I'm always exporting these certain parameters or key parameters. And then if they run into an issue, I can quickly replicate what's happening on their machine. I have them send me that text file. I can either read that in or manually key in those values. Again, replicate what's going on and solve that problem. The second thing that does is it creates a record for the end user as well. They can store that text file along with that configuration and say, hey, for job 1, 2, 3, this was the inputs that we put in there. Okay, so if I simply wanted to modify and make export a couple of my parameters that are in here, I can use what's already here, right? And just change the values that are getting written out, right? Length, I've got width, and I've got height, okay? So I'm simply modifying what the text is going to come out, right, in between the quotation marks. And then I'm concatenating the length, the width, and the height parameter behind that. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and save and run this. It's asking me to save my user snippets XML because I created a new custom snippets, right? I'm not gonna worry about saving that thing. Okay, and then up pops my notepad, right? And there's those those values that I spit out, the length and the width and the height. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and close that and pull my rule back up here. That way of getting those values out may or may not be the best for your situation. If you're just throwing out a few, nothing wrong with doing it that way. In the case I'm going to do here now is I'm going to loop through all of my user parameters, and then I'm going to export those. Okay, so up above where I'm creating that text file, again, this is our out of the box section, right? I'm going to do some declarations here. And rather than watching me type them, I'm going to paste them in, okay? The code that we go through today and some of the data set will be available. So if you'd like to get the code and you'd like to get some of the models that we work with, you can reach out to your account executive or your account manager, and we'll get those to you, okay? So real quick, what this declarations at the top is doing is simply declaring the document I'm working in as an assembly document. Okay, right now we are specifying this has to be an assembly document. And then I'm going to look at the user parameters collection. Okay, so again, everything that's in my user parameters. So I'm going to keep the same information as far as creating that text file, but I'm going to modify a couple of these lines as well. Okay, nothing terribly exciting about what's going on there either. I'm simply exporting part number, and then this is the iLogic snippet for getting out a part number, right? If I go back over to my system tab under iProperties, that is this part number snippet. Okay, and then the same thing with the title. So again, at the top of my text file here, I'm going to have the part number, I'm going to have the title, a little divider line, and then a blank line. Okay, just giving me some header information for what I want listed out on that text file. Okay, and then for each user param in user params, right? Remember user param, if I look up here, that's a user parameter. So what I'm saying here is each user param inside of the user parameters collection, I want you to write out the value again with my write line. Okay, again, I'm just simply doing some more concatenation here. I'm getting out the parameter name, I'm putting the equal sign, and then I'm looking at the expression value. Yeah, I'll talk about that more in just a second. But notice what I'm not doing here is I'm not specifying certain parameters. I'm saying give me every user parameter, tell me what the name of it is, and then tell me what the expression of it is. Okay. This is a good way of making this, again, very generic, something that can be used against multiple assemblies no matter what the parameter values in it are. Okay. So I'm gonna go ahead and save and run this guy. And then there's my text file that popped up, right? I've got my part number, I've got the title, that divider line, the blank line that I was talking about. And then there's my list of parameters that are currently in my model, right? Length, width, height, style. Notice some of the values look a little different than they did before. So the length is telling me 20 foot. The width is telling me 3 foot, as opposed to the values we saw before. That's because I'm looking at the expression now, right? Initially, I was calling out the individual user parameter, which was giving me the values. If I pop open my parameters dialog box here, we can see that the equation in this length parameter is 20 ft, right? 20 feet. So that expression value is giving me what's inside of there. Okay. So again, we made this very generic so it could work with just about any assembly. Well, it would work with any assembly, right? If I only want to look at key parameters, okay, there's a way we can put a check in here for key parameters. I should have pointed it out while I was in the parameters dialog box. Notice there's some of these that are marked as key. It's a good way of filtering out your parameters dialog box so I can see one thing or another. It's also very handy to, what I do is mark my parameters key that I'm going to end up putting on the UI or on the form. The forms editor inside of iLogic, I can easily say, just show me the key parameters and put those, drag and drop those onto my form. Okay. So this will be a very quick check right here. I'm going to say for each user parameters in OUserParams, we just need to look at the is key. Okay. Again, I'm looping through each one, so I'm going to look at the is key property. This is a property. It's a Boolean. It's either going to come back true or false. So what I'm saying here is if that is marked as true, then go ahead and write it out. If not, it's just going to skip it and move on to the next guy. Okay, so I'm going to save and run that guy. And then now the only thing we see are the length, width, and height, right? Quite often if you're building, something that's configuring large assemblies or a large configurator, you may have multiple or lots of parameters in there, but I don't necessarily need all of those exported in this way. If I'm really trying to replicate what the user entered onto the user interface or the form, I would possibly want to capture just my keys. Okay. So we were spitting all that out to a text file, right? Down here at the end, we are simply opening the TXT, and up here we're starting with that TXT. There's another one inside of the custom, this export parameters to CSV. It works very similar. It's still doing a stream writer. It's got a lot more information in here, as you can see. It builds a table asking for what parameters that you want. But again, we can modify that to do the same thing we did before where we're looping through. Okay. So one of the big differences here is what that file name is, right? It's just concatenating the CSV there. And again, whatever Windows default for opening that file type, it would work that way. Okay. This does have a question at the bottom as well, asking you if you want to open that file. Okay. I'm gonna go ahead and cancel that and not bother saving that. All right, so the next methods I want to talk about are reading and saving parameters to an XML file. There's always been a manual version of this, not always, but for quite a while, under the parameters expanded panel. Okay, there's an import from XML and an export to XML. Okay, in the past, I've used this to export parameters and then copy those or load them into some other assembly. Okay, so if I was manually going to do this, I would simply give it a file name. And then we have some options here for whether or not I want to export all parameters or whether or not I want to export just my key parameters. Okay. Then I would go over to my new assembly and choose the import, pick the XML file, and then all of those parameters and their equations would come along with that. Okay, so I'm going to start a rule here called export XML. We can also do that with code. Okay, this is on my system tab in my parameters category. Down here at the bottom, there's a load XML and a save XML. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and enter both of those into my rules editor so we can look at what they're doing. They both look very similar, right? The only difference is the method that it's calling here. This top one is doing a save and the bottom one's doing a load. Okay, so I'm going to export my parameters first. I'm not going to worry about that guy. I'm going to put a piece of code here in the front of this that's just, again, getting out that document name, that file name, and then concatenate an XML with it, right? I'm doing a string dot concat against it as opposed to the ampersand. And then I want to export the name in this case. Okay. So I'm gonna go ahead and save and run that. We've got nothing that's opening this up right now. Let me open up my, right. So here's the right parameters to text XML that we just created here at 120. So if I open that with Notepad++, right, there's my XML file. Okay, so let's start a new part. And then I'm going to read in what we just exported, right? There's no parameters inside of here. Let's make sure there's nothing behind the magic curtain. So in this case, I'm importing an XML. So load XML, I'm gonna come over here and copy the path from this thing. Okay, again, we're doing the parameters XML load method. So once I run that, I can open up my parameters dialog box, and there's all my parameters. Okay, so again, a handy way of copying parameters from one assembly to another. In addition, there is a is keys only argument that we can add to this. Okay, if I go back to my parameters category, there is a save XML keys only, and I'm going to put this right above that guy. So really, the only difference is this keys only argument at the back end. Okay, if I hover over that function, that method against that, I can see again what arguments are required. There's the doc, a file name as a string, and then there's an optional save options, right? And that's what that keys only is doing. So just like we saw before, where I was checking the is key property for each parameter, that keys only allows me to export just the key parameters. Okay. So let's look at using the measure snippets. Okay, I'm going to measure some distance between multiple entities. If you've seen any of my iLogic webcasts, this is probably familiar to you. I use this slider bed conveyor quite often. So I've got a parameter inside here called maximum leg span. And I, as a designer, I know that if my legs get to be so far apart from each other, I need an additional center leg, right? If I switch my conveyor length here to 150 and hit configure, it turns on that middle leg, right? Again, that's a wonderful thing about iLogic is I can capture that tribal knowledge, things I know has to happen, put it inside there and let it worry about doing that. Okay, so I'm gonna go back to 85 real quick here, and we'll see that middle leg get turned off. Okay, I'm gonna jump into my rules here and look at my configure frame rule. So right down here on this line is where we're calculating that leg span. Okay, I'm doing some math there to say this is what the leg span is. My overall length minus the end roller offsets minus the mounting drive offsets. Okay, that works, but let's look at doing another way of solving that, another solution for this. We'll use the measure minimum distance snippet. So right now I want to comment out that leg span. And then in my measure category, I've got a minimum distance and a minimum distance within components, right? Quite often, a lot of these snippets, you'll have component versions, you'll have assembly versions, and that really generally means another argument that allows me to tell I need to find an entity in a specific component, okay? And since I want to look at the brackets that those legs are attached to, right? It's not something at the top level, it's something down at the lower levels. Okay, so I'm going to copy my leg span value there, and it's going to measure the minimum distance between, again, here's my component 1, and what's the entity inside there? My component 2 and the entity inside there. Okay. Rather than me typing stuff, again, I'm going to paste in what I'm looking for. So I'm grabbing origin planes, right? The YZ plane in adjustment plane 1 measured against the YZ plane in adjustment plate 2, and give me that minimum distance between those. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and save that and pop open my rule. I'm going to go to 150 and let's see what happens. Right? We don't have that middle leg. That middle leg didn't come on. Yeah, I am at 150. Let's run it again. As soon as I hit that configure button, that middle leg comes up, right? I see this quite often on support tickets, questions from clients. No, I have to run a rule twice in order to get what I want to happen. Okay, this is generally an indicator of you're doing some math or some calculations prior to what's actually happening in your model. So let's go back into that configure frame, right? I'm reading my leg span right here. That's measuring the distance between those origin planes and those components. But those components have yet to update, right? I'm passing down values to them, but on the screen, or as far as Inventor knows, those values haven't moved. So when I run it once, it modifies my conveyor frame bed. It reads the distance. It says, oh, I don't need to turn that leg on. And then it updates things to where my bed length actually changes. Okay. So the second time I run it through, it sees that new distance between the two. Then my leg span is what I expect it to be. Okay. So if you're going to do something like this, using the measuring tools, a couple of ways we can make sure that we're what we want to be measuring is use some document updates, right? I can do a document update with the false argument. I don't necessarily need to update the graphics, but I do want to push those values out, make sure that thing is updating. Another way would be moving things around in my code, right? So that I'm sure I'm working with a updated assembly the way I want it to be. Okay. So now let's pop back open my form. I'll go to 80. Hit configure there, and my middle leg does work as I expect it to, right? Because the model is updating before it takes the measure distance. Okay. If you have a large configurator, if you're doing a lot of work, updating it may not be your best option. You may want to make sure that your code, where you're taking that measurement, is in a good spot relative to where I'm doing my my modifications. Okay. So let's go ahead and close that guy. The next ones I want to talk about are running other rules with an argument map. Okay, let me pop open a rule here, and I'm going to call it hole spacing. in my run other category, we have this run rule snippet. It allows me to, at that point in time, go run another rule, right? We also have this run rule with map. And what that allows me to do is pass arguments to some other rule, okay? That way I can build modularized rules or rules that do one specific thing. I can pass them values, much like a function or a subroutine, and allow them to do what they need to do. And then if it's a function, I can have it return values back to me. Okay, so this is the run rule with map snippet. And all it's doing there is creating a name value map, and it's adding one simple argument. It's called argument one, and then they're giving it a value. And then it does exactly just that run rule, right? That's what we've probably used in the past, just the iLogic VB.run rule with just the name. But here we have this additional argument of that map. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and cancel that for the time being. Let's look at what we're doing here with this part, right? It's gonna be so long. I know what the end offsets for those holes are, and quite often clients will have a maximum hole spacing, right? Maybe this is a mounted bar that goes onto something. They don't really care what that hole spacing is as long as it doesn't, right, exceed what our maximum is. So the configurator is going to be configuring what the length of this thing needs to be. I know what the end offsets are. I need to calculate the largest hole spacing that I can, again, without exceeding what that maximum is. Okay, I could certainly have that little bit of code that does that calculation in multiple spots in my rules. I could even write a function, right, as part of my main sub that goes and does that. But then if you're going to build another configurator, I have to copy that same function over to that other one. If we modularize these things and make just that little bit of code its own rule, and I pass it values, then I can call that rule from just about anything I want, right? As long as I'm giving it valid data. So let's look at what we need to create that first. Okay. Again, I'm making a rule here. Oh, hit the wrong one. I want the run rule with map. Right. I'm going to replace some of that. Okay. Again, with stuff I've already got typed out, just so you don't see me typing here. It's doing the same thing here. I'm calling it rule arguments as opposed to map. And then I'm adding an argument called OAL, overall length, and that's simply doing a calculation of the length minus my end offset times 2. That's giving me that whole span. Okay, and then I'm also passing along the maximum spacing parameter. Right, so I'm adding an argument called max spacing and giving the max spacing parameter. Then I need to go call that rule. Okay. My notes here have a little bit more comments than what the other one did. So here I'm doing a run external rule, running this calculate hole spacing, and again, passing it those values, passing it the OAL and passing it the max spacing. Right. I'm going to treat this one like a function. It's going to go out that separate rule, the calculate hole spacing rule, is going to go run something, and then it's going to give me values back. Okay. I'm going to retrieve that value from that function rule. So here I'm declaring hole values as an array list, and then it's going to be set equal to the return argument coming back from my rule. Okay. Again, right in here is where that other rule is running and doing what it needs to do. okay? Then I need to get some information, again, back from that still. So I'm setting my whole quantity and my whole spacing to those indices from the array list, right? The first thing that's going to come back in that array list, right? This is 0 index based, so the first one's going to be the whole quantity. The second one is going to be the whole spacing. Okay. I'm going to move this over to the side a little bit and pull up that calculate whole spacing rule. Okay, this is just, it's an external rule. I'm showing it inside of Visual Studio Code. Okay, up here at the top is simply some stuff about what needs to be passed into this, what it's going to return. So just like we saw over here on the left where I'm passing arguments, the first thing this is doing is getting those arguments and I'm using them, passing them into parameters or variables in this case, okay? I'm saying the OAL in this rule is equal to what's getting passed along in that rules arguments, and then the same thing with the max spacing there. Okay. Throwing that data out to both the logger and debug view, that's with these next trace lines and the logger lines, right? And then it's doing some calculations. Okay. Are we greater than the max spacing? If so, add a hole, redo some math, etc. And the very end of this, again, remember, I got to pass data back to that. So I'm declaring a new array list. I'm giving it the whole quantity and the whole spacing, right? That would calculate it up here at the top. And then I'm setting the return value equal to that array list. Right, then we're going to jump back over to this guy and it's going to say, oh, whole values is equal to that return value. Get that data out of that array list and then continue on doing what you need to do. In this case, it's simply setting those parameters so my part is going to update. Okay, I'm just going to go ahead and save this guy for the time being. Hit close. I'm going to go over to my forms. Right, I'm going to modify my length parameter here. Set him to 12. Let's say my max spacing is 1. Right. Showing down here on the bottom what those guys work out to be. Okay, so again, taking the rule here and it's passing it down to the calculate whole spacing rule. And we can see that through the logger if we'd like. Okay, I'm going to clear this thing for the time being. And I'm going to modify this length value. And then we can see what's going on. I do have detailed trace turned on. So we can see that we went into rule 0. The trigger for that was the length value because length parameter got modified. Then it's entering the calculate whole spacing rule. It's doing some math, it's figuring out what it needs to do, and it's passing it back, and then I'm back in the rule 0. Okay. So in this case, again, I'm replicating a function. Doesn't have to be, I just wouldn't be getting back a return value, right? I could simply be running another external rule to go do something, and then I don't have to worry about getting data back. But I'm still passing it some arguments. Right? And again, the benefit to that is from any code anywhere, if I want to know what spacing could be used, I simply throw data at this thing, get back what I need, and go about my business. Okay. The benefit to modularizing it is I'm not replicating that code all over the place. I don't have to write it again. If I need to make modification to it, I'm going to one spot as opposed to multiples. Okay. So last here is getting model names and model parameters. So I've got a drawing here that is based on that hole spacing part we just talked about. There is some code in here already to set the view scale the way I want it. Let's look at adding center marks to each one of those holes, right? If I jump back over real quick, this is a rectangular pattern, right, based upon that hole. So yes, again, there's multiple ways I could be doing this. This is just one example of how I can get data from a model in my drawing and do something with that. Okay, so I'm gonna add a rule here called center marks. And we are in 2021 here. So the 2021 release gave us a new drawing category, a lot of new annotation stuff here that wasn't available to you before. Okay, so if I double click the center mark, right, I'm declaring my first sheet, I'm declaring my first view, and then I'm getting some model intent. Okay, it's going to default to this whole edge. My intent inside of my part is called edge hole. It's the noun, it's an edge, and then where's it coming from? And then it's simply going to add a center mark to that. Okay, I hit save and run, and again, we see that one center mark on there. If I go back to my hole spacing part and look at the geometry tab, right, there is that edge that's marked. So that is named geometry. That's great for that first one, but what about all of the additional? Okay, so this is where I want to get out some data from my model. Something down at the very bottom here is this advanced drawing API category. Okay, and I've got model document, whether getting it from a view or getting the file name, whatever I ended up needing to get from that. I'm going to choose the model document name, and that's going to get the full file name property of the model document or the first model document, right? This happens to be the only one listed in here. If you had multiples, you'd have to worry about, which one you're grabbing there. And it's going to store that value in this model name parameter. Another snippet that's inside of there is get a model parameter. And that uses that model name argument that we just got to get out some parameter. Okay. In this case, I'm going to call this whole quantity. And that happens to be the parameter that's inside of that model, right? That's what we saw that other rule calculating. Okay. So now that I have that, I know how many whole quantities are in there, or how many holes are in there. So again, with our drawing snippets, we have intents on pattern face. Okay. I actually want to start off doing some manage items first. That way it's going to let iLogic control what's there, what doesn't have to be there. So I'm going to do a simple for loop here for I equals 1 to whole quantity. And then inside of that, I'm going to do this intent on pattern face. Okay. Again, this is getting the intent down in a component level of some pattern. I don't need this first argument because we're not working inside of assembly. I'm simply working with a part, and he is called rectangular pattern. So I'm going to go steal that name out of here so I don't have to type it. What indices are you looking for? I, right? Where I is going to increment from 1 to the whole quantity. So for each one that's in there, I'm going to get that pattern. Okay. And then I don't need this guy up top. I'm going to put him down here. So for each intent of that pattern that I find, I'm going to add a center mark. Okay. I don't want to go just off my whole intent. I want to go off that pattern face. I do also need to concatenate the I here, right? If not, it's going to run through and build the first whole center mark, and then it's going to run through and try to build another one, and it won't be able to, right? There's already one existing there that it's trying to manage. So in this case, I'm just concatenate the I, so it's going to be called whole center mark 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever that happens to be. Okay. So now if I save and run that thing, notice I got center marks on all of my holes. More than likely, I would want that to be set up as an event trigger, right? So anytime I've opened that document or anytime there's a drawing view change, I want that rule to run. Okay, so let me jump back over to my part again. I'll make this guy 12.625 with an end offset of 5/8, and let's go max spacing of 4. Okay. Once I switch over to my hole spacing, again, that event trigger is going to fire off. It modified my view. For a second there, you might have seen those orphaned center marks, right? But then once the rule ran and managed those, it deleted them and then recreated new ones. Okay. So let me go back in there and show that center marks rule again for a second. Okay. So that's it. Again, we went through some out-of-the-box snippets and did a little customization to them. We exported parameters to text files. We exported parameters to XML files. We measured distance between entities, right? And then we used that to make a determination of whether or not components needed to be there. We ran other rules with arguments. So I was passing arguments down to rules and returning arguments back to the original rules. And then in this case, we were getting that model name. So I can get inside there and get that parameter, in this case, the whole quantity parameter, but it could be just about anything that I wanted to, right? And then do some stuff against that. Okay. And again, if you'd like to, some of these snippets, or at least the rules, and most of these part files that we worked with here, reach out to your account executive. Just say, hey, I was on this webcast. I'd like to get some of that data set, and we'll make sure we get that stuff down to you. So